Hello and welcome to this training event for the BTEC Tech Award in Art and Design Practice. In this session, we'll be looking at marking and moderation for the internally assessed components. My name is Simon Fox, and I'll be your trainer for the session. The objectives of today's session are to understand levels-based mark schemes, how to use the Pearson set assignment and the Exemplar standardization materials, to understand the moderation process for internal assessment, including assessment series and results, also understand the awarding and grading processes, and an overview of quality assurance, including key dates and further support. First, we'll look at applying the mark grids and understanding how they work and compensatory assessment. So the mark grids we apply use a best fit approach. There's a simple 12 mark per grid and 3 mark band structure, making best fit decisions more consistent. It's compensatory, so learners take forward all marks gained towards the overall qualification outcome. The mark bands are numerical, and it's important to note that they don't align with pass, merit, and distinction grades for each component. We'll explain how the awarding process works later and why this is the case. But it is important that you get a rank order of your learners established for each component so you can work out who got the highest marks, who got the lowest marks, and a clear rank order of learners in between. Okay, to start off, let's have a quick look at the mark grids. So the mark grids are published by Pearson every year, and they remain pretty much consistent every year. So you can teach these with confidence, and you can use these with your learners and use them in practice assessments and work together to make sure that everybody understands what the mark grids are looking for and how to get the best out of your learners. So I'll just move to the first grid. So each of the learning outcomes for component 1 will have a series of marks. So what we talk about when we say best fit decisions is that you're looking at the evidence in front of you that the learner has produced, and you're looking at the statements within the mark grid and deciding which statement best fits the evidence that you're looking at. So as you can see here, there are 4 bands, and each band has a series of descriptors. And the descriptors will give an indication of the quality of the evidence. So you can see here that mark band 1 is for lower performing learners. It's basic, limited, superficial, and tentative evidence. These are the descriptors we're using. Mark band 2 has adequate, sufficient, some or partial coverage, and straightforward. So we're looking at learners who've applied their understanding and knowledge. They've got some skills and they're doing what they're told, but it goes beyond limited and basic, but it's not quite ready for mark band 3, where we're looking at competent, appropriate, and mostly clear evidence. And all the way through to mark band 4. So these are your high performing learners who are providing confident, effective, thorough, and in-depth evidence. And you can see that within learning outcome A, we're looking at investigation and experimentation processes in art and design practice. So the key thing here is that we are asking the learners to think about how to research, how to look at external primary and secondary sources and respond to this, and then use experimentation and testing and iterative working through ideas to develop ideas for the next stage. And you'll see that in the mark bands, you've got these statements. So the first statement is looking at the application of investigation methods, including primary and secondary resources. So this is clearly an indication that learners must have primary and secondary sources in their evidence. So they'll be looking at research of other artists or designers, but they're also undertaking some observational drawing or mark making or photography in their own work. The second statement looks at the practical responses to the work of others, showing an understanding of how they communicate visually. So what we're asking here is that they're not just slavishly copying or providing a pastiche of other artists. They're thinking about why the artists or designers they've chosen, how they respond to the theme, and how their materials, techniques, and processes and use of media communicate visually to an audience. So there's an exploration of that in a practical way. The second statement is about the use of practical experimentation, and showing an awareness of how art design materials, techniques, and processes are used to communicate. So this is about visual communication. It's about understanding the main processes by which you communicate in a visual way, use of color, line, texture, for example, narrative. Um, and again, what we're looking at here is when you are faced with the evidence that the learner produced for the assignment, you've got to think, well, is this evidence adequate? Is it competent? Does it show effective use of experimentation? Um, are the practical responses showing an in-depth understanding? Or is it an adequate understanding, or is it just a basic understanding? So again, across all of the mark grid, you make these decisions and then you decide what mark you give them. So you may find that a learner's evidence flits between the mark bands, and that's why the mark bands, each one has got 3 marks. So you can say, well, it's solidly within mark band 3, so I'm going to give it 8 marks. Or you think, actually, some of the evidence is pushing towards mark band 4. Some of it is quite confident. Some of it's quite thorough. So maybe I'll give them 9 or possibly even 10 marks. So you've got that flexibility within the mark bands to make quite granular, quite detailed decisions. And all of these marks go forward to the awarding process. So a learner can get a different range of marks across the different topics. So when we look at learning outcome B, this is about generating and communicating art and design ideas. So it's about recording and communication of ideas that are informed by the investigation that they've done previously and showing exploration of creative opportunities in relation to the brief. So they've looked at the brief, they've looked at the theme, they've undertaken some initial research. Now we're looking at coming up with an idea, coming up with a creative response. So the use of ideas generation techniques need to be recorded. So this is very important that learners need to be recording at every stage of their assignment what they're doing. So it's really useful for them to have initial sketches, mind maps, working through simple ideas, exploring different techniques, and thinking about how these relate to the brief and what opportunities do this exploration provide in terms of producing a final creative output. And again, we're going from limited generation to adequate to competent to confident. We're going from basic exploration to sufficient to clear to in-depth. So again, you can make a quality judgment about how good the evidence is based on these statements, and you've picked the one that's the best fit. Learning outcome C has a number of marks. First of all, we're looking at the selection of materials. So we're saying that the materials, techniques, and processes that the learner chooses are relevant to their intentions. So they've done some research, they've experimented, they've tried different things out, and now they're thinking about, well, which approach is going to work best for the piece that I want to produce. So it's really important when you're delivering the unit that learners have access to a range of materials and media. They've had some practice with a range of different techniques and processes, and they are then deciding which ones to apply to the assignment based on the theme, based on their investigation, and based on how they want to provide the outcome. So what version, what format, what medium they're using. So it's important that they actually select that within the assignment because it's an accessible element of how they've selected it and whether it's pertinent to what they want to produce and whether it's been informed by their experimentation and their initial research. The next one is about applying practical skill. So how do they manipulate materials, techniques, and processes? So it's about the quality of their outcomes. How good are they at drawing, painting, photography, mark making, sculpture, fabric cutting? Depending, whatever the discipline they're doing, it's about the quality of their execution of that, so their application of materials. So again, we're talking about basic, through to adequate, through to competent, through to confident. Continuing with learning outcome C, we've now got an application and development and review processes leading to refinement of work. So it's important that not only are they undertaking research and recording that in the first initial stages, that they're documenting their progress throughout the assignment and that they can then show that they've stepped back and they've undertaken some review and they've thought about how can I improve this? How can I refine the work? Am I still meeting the brief? Am I meeting my initial intentions? Has it developed and why? So it's an element here of justifying their decisions about why they've made creative and technical or practical decisions and reviewed that and made value judgments. So there's an element here that they need to record their ongoing critical reflection, if you like, to make sure that you can see evidence that the learner's thinking this through and their working processes are helping them refine and improve their work as they continue. And then finally, learning outcome D, which is recording and communicating the skills development. So we feel it's really important in art and design practice that presentation is given sufficient weight. It's really important that learners know how to present their work to show off the strengths and qualities of the pieces they're producing, but also how they can explain and justify their work. And the presentation of it is clear, coherent, also logical, also follows a consistent aesthetic. So they're actually being assessed on the presentation of their work as well. So things like photographing work, things like maybe using digital presentation software, thinking about layouts and use of digital text. These are all things you can be teaching in component one before they do the assessment to get the best out of it so that the learners understand that how they present their work is also part of the assessed process. Okay, we'll go back to the slides. So now we're going to look at some exemplar standardization materials. I'll explain what these are. They're there for you to use with your colleagues. They're examples of learner work that have been marked. So not only have you got some learner work from learners who've done a previous paper and they've provided a full response, you get the full example of what the learner submitted for the component one. You also get the marks that they received and a justification from the moderator about why they gave them those marks and what happens. So you can use these for internal standardization for all of your center assessors. So if you're working in a program team where there's more than one teacher going to be making assessment decisions, then these are really useful for you to work together, look at the work, think about why those marks have been given, thinks about whether it agrees with what your judgments were, and make sure that you understand that this is the standard we're looking at, because we've got a very wide range of achievement here, right down from pass at level 1 all the way through to distinction at level 2. So you may have a very wide differentiation across your groups. So it's really useful to know where the marks could sit. They're available from September every year. And after each moderation window, we produce more. So the ones I'm looking at the moment are freely available on the Pearson website on the qualification specification page, and you can download them at any point. You don't need to access materials using OSCAR anymore. So because of the change in the assessment model for these tech awards and the simplification of the quality assurance process, you don't have to have a nominated lead internal verifier or use the OSCAR process. Everything's just freely available on the website, and you can recommend that we save them so you can build them up as you go. An important note, though, we'd be cautious about showing these to learners simply because this is simply an example of how a learner responded to this particular paper. And of course, if you show them to learners, they might think, well, this learner got lots of marks, so I'm just going to copy what they did. The point is that there are many ways in which learners can address the requirements of the tasks. So these are for teacher use and shouldn't really be shared with learners. You can talk to learners about the mark grid. You can talk about the descriptors and what you're looking for in assessment and how they might provide evidence of that. But we'd just be careful about showing them examples of a learner, simply because learners might feel that this is how you should do it. And of course, there's a million ways that a learner could respond to it. So let's have a look at some examples of standardization materials. We'll start with a learner who got a high mark. So again, these are freely available on the website. And what you see is an introduction. It explains how it works and what it's all for. In this particular case, this learner responded to the Pearson set assignment from June 2023. So following the introduction, you've got the Pearson set assignment. We're going to look at a more recent Pearson set assignment later in this session, so I'll just skip over this, but just to explain that the vocational context for this particular paper was narrative. And now we have the learner work itself. So this is their initial front page. You'll notice that there's a contextualized design brief here. When we look at the Pearson set assignment, you'll see that the theme, the vocational context is given, but centers are able to put in an extra level of contextualization. So for example, if you're doing a design technology program, or if you're focusing on fashion, you might want to actually add to the assignment brief to give it more of a product design or a fashion angle. So in this case, you see that there was a contextualized angle to it. So the theme was narrative, but this is clearly a product design style course, and learners were asked to produce a new fragrance for a brand of your choice based on the theme of narrative. So they're thinking about marketing, thinking about product packaging, and you'll see how that develops as the program goes through. So this learner started looking at Banksy, started looking at stencil graffiti, and they've picked some relevant images and thought about why they're there and done some relatively simple analysis of those images, and then started looking at how they could produce stencil art themselves. So they've got a version of Banksy's work where they've got a missile sent from Russia with a bow on it, sort of mocking the idea of from Russia with love. So they've thought about sort of different levels of meaning here and putting it together. And what they've shown is the stencils they use. So they're showing here, if you think about assessment learning outcome A, where you're responding in a practical way to other artists or designers. So they're showing how they've used stencil art to make their image and the different color separations. Now they're looking at Richard Hamilton. So they're thinking about collage and thinking about narrative imagery, a little bit of discussion about what there might be in there. How does the image produce an overall narrative based from disparate images elements in collage? So again, quite useful to think about how that's done. And then they've done their own, so they've put together a similar kind of interior of juxtaposition of different images, but made it much more up to date. So you've got references to Netflix, you've got screens, you've got there's Ukraine and Russian flags on the cushions, for example. So there's an element of satire there. So this learner's clearly thinking about topical issues and thinking about how to respond to that in a visual way. And then the notes around the edge kind of explain that and think about why they've included it and what they want to say with it. As I said, I'm flicking through these for this event. You can download these materials and look at them in much more detail in your own time. Then looking again at pop art, and this time they're looking at Andy Warhol and repeated images and the use of screen print and the use of degraded images. But again, remember that the theme was the context that the center put on it was product design. So it does make sense that they chose Warhol in terms of commercial art bleeding into fine art and how to do that. And they've started using lino printed processes. Now, it's worth noting that the learner found the original image on the internet here. So they have explained that and they've manipulated it slightly. So they've acknowledged the source and then they've created a physical lino print. And they're looking at multiple images, different techniques, different approaches. So you can see how that's reflecting the Warhol style. Then looking at a contemporary artist, Sam Cox, or also known as Mr. Doodle. Yeah, and he's a fellow who's actually doodled every single surface in his house, and he builds up composite images from small little doodles. And so it's thinking about how that works, and then some discussion about what the effect is. And then the learner's done their own little version of it. So they've done a version, and again, sticking with this Star Wars theme, they've used Boba Fett, and they've done like a little portrait of Boba Fett using doodles. And there's a close-up of the doodles that they're using. Okay, so now we're looking into the actual design brief. So it's to design and prototype a new aftershave with collaboration with Star Wars and Hugo Boss, suitable for a younger businessman with the theme of a galaxy far, far away. So there's quite a lot to unpack there. So they're thinking about their audience, their target customer base. They're thinking about an established brand. So Hugo Boss obviously already produces perfumes. Um, and they're thinking about a theme of Star Wars, which gives that narrative element, and obviously it's something that they feel that the audience, the customer base, would be interested in. They've done some initial market research into Hugo Boss, what market products are already out there, thinking about the costs, aesthetics, function, ergonomics, environment, quality, and user. So some quite in-depth discussion here, some quite in-depth research into existing products, which is really useful to see. And now we're seeing initial drawings and ideas for the perfume bottle. You can see how they're incorporating the Star Wars theme with R2-D2, C-3PO, and the Death Star, and different shapes and insignia, with notes explaining decisions and discussing how they might work or may not work. This next page starts now looking at packaging ideas, so the box that the bottle will be put in, thinking about simple logos, and you can see how they've developed that from their initial simple lino cuts and working on a Death Star logo and different ideas, thinking about brand identity and how to bring that in. Now they're thinking about the 3D model, so the actual bottle itself and how that will work. So they're looking at dimensions, some initial sketches there, working it out as a maquette in foam, so easy to cut. They can work it out and get the shapes, think about the ergonomics, developing ideas about colors and styles and how it will ultimately be finished. More refinement of the theme, more thinking about how to put together this image and getting it to stand up and getting it ergonomic and fit inside the box. Further refinement. And again, remember, review and refinement is something that needs to be recorded, so it's really important that this is in there. And then the final piece. Now, one of the things we should say is there's been quite a jump here. They've gone from producing the maquette in foam, and now actually the final piece is in aluminium and acrylic, and it's used CAD, laser cutting, it's used engraving, it's used laminating, finishing, filing and polishing. So one of the things we'll talk about when we look at the grades is that seems to be an awful jump. So was there some evidence that really could have been put in there about the actual final product design? So maybe they dropped a few marks there. But in terms of the actual thing, it's quite impressive that they produced such a finish on their final product, and the fact that it does actually work as an article itself. And then the packaging ideas, so they'd looked at the dimension, they looked at how to the logos and the look of it, but now they're looking at the actual, how to put together single sheets to tuck around and create a box. Then there's a little poster where they've placed the items in context. So this is part of the overall marketing. Then they've gone back to the doodle thing and put in some images there. So they're putting it together. And again, maybe you'd question why they bothered with this, because I think they'd gone off in a direction and then stuck this back in again. So this learner did pretty well. They got 70 marks, and it's a comprehensive body of work, I'm sure you'll agree, which clearly addresses all of the learning aims. So the portfolio documents all stages of the design development cycle, provides a creative and unexpected approach to responding to the theme of narrative. So there's a lot of good points here, a lot of plus points. But what we'll do now is we'll just break that down and see why that learner got those marks. So in the first place, they got 10 marks. So it wasn't entirely solidly in mark band 4. There were some things that they could have maybe improved, and there's some things you maybe questioned. So the moderator said the learners conducted a competent investigation into a range of practitioners, including Banksy, Richard Hamilton, Andy Warhol, and sort of Sam Cox. So it's a nice range. Um, Includes appropriate experimentation in the style of the practitioners, uses a range of different media. Some of the earlier investigative work, whilst relevant to the theme, does little to inform their own practical work. So there's a few blanks in there where they didn't really take it any further. But you do see as the project progresses how the experimentation into practitioner style starts to include imagery relevant. So they started bringing in these Star Wars imagery. They started thinking about how that stuff was applied and how they could use it. Um, but detailed and effective analysis of a range of aftershave bottles. So that was really good. So that sort of contextual research into product design was really useful. So they're at the bottom of Mark Band 4. So it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. So 10 out of 12 for that. Grid 2, not quite so strong. There's 8 out of 12 here. So the learners competently experimented with a range of materials, techniques, and processes. So if you think about it, they had collage, they had stencil, graffiti, they had printmaking, they had lots of different drawing processes, digital as well as they moved on. There's a clear understanding of how materials, techniques, and processes can be used to communicate effectively, but it's a little bit disconnected from the learner's intentions. So they looked at artists and they looked at product design, but they didn't really look at designers, and they didn't really look at people who are actually involved in designing products or articles that would be more closely related to what they're actually producing. So it's an interesting approach, but possibly the relevance could have been more effective. Where they did very well, though, is in learning outcome B. So we got 12 out of 12 here. So really nothing to bring them down on this one. There's a wide range of evidence demonstrating confident generation, recording, communication of ideas and intentions. For a level 2 learner, this is pretty strong work. So there's mood board, initial design drawings, annotation. Importantly, the annotation is reviewing the strengths of the ideas. It's not simply descriptive. And I think that's something to pick up, that they're not simply telling you what they've done. We have eyes, we can see what they've done. We want to know why they've done it and what they think of it and whether they think it's effective. So actually the learner's annotations are pretty good here. They've thought about brand identity, logo and packaging. So they've packed a lot in the short space of time they've got to do the assignment. There's clearly a link between the earlier investigations and what they've then explored. So I think that's an important thing to pick up on. We're talking about how the ideas are informed by investigation. And what we find with lower achieving learners is that they do the research, they do the experimentation because they've been told to, and then they come up with an idea for the final piece. And the two things aren't connected at all. They haven't thought about, why was I doing the research? Why was I experimenting? How is this going to inform what I do later? Higher achieving learners join those dots and make that connection, and that's really important. So again, that's something you can train learners on. You can teach them in the earlier stages of the component before they do the actual assessment, how to use purposeful, effective experimentation. So learning outcomes C, there's quite a lot here, and a bit of a mix. So developing practical skills, we thought it was pretty good, but it was 8 out of 12. So they used an appropriate range of materials, techniques, and processes, certainly, and these are relevant to their intentions, but it's not always clear from the portfolio why or how these materials have been selected. So there's not much discussion or justification. And then this jump from planning it, and then without any discussion or justification, they've just started using acrylic and aluminium and laser cutting. And you think to yourself, there's a lot of work in between those two sheets that wasn't present in the evidence. So you have to go on the evidence that you've seen. And so actually in this case, the learner's not really presented a full range of evidence because there seems to be a big gap in the final refinement of the shapes and decisions on the color to the actual final piece. So they lost a few marks there, but it's still good quality. They did better on the next grid, which is looking at the final response and the practical skill, an 11 out of 12 here. I think you'll agree that the final piece and the quality of the evidence throughout was pretty good for a learner at this level. And we would expect that, they effectively used appropriate tools and equipment to produce pretty good quality outcomes. So we gave them 11 out of 12 for that. And finally, for learning outcome C, 9 for about the application of development and review processes. So it's certainly a clearly constructed and logical portfolio. What we're looking at here is how the learner's responses evolved, trialing different approaches, exploring alternative options. So it's pretty good, but in terms of the thoroughness of that and the thoroughness of the justifications and how they could effectively refine it, there's room for improvement there, we think. And learning outcome D. So this is the final grid, and this is about the presentation. And again, I think in the case of this, for a learner at this level, it was a very well presented portfolio. It's clearly detailed, cohesive. It really effectively documents the learner's creative process, apart from that little blip in the jump to the final outcome. But in terms of how it's actually put together, it's very cohesive. It's clearly been considered. The presentation of the final outcomes is pretty good. So it's right at the top of the mark band here. So the learner did 70 marks overall. Very, very well done. So tips for this. So learning aim A, really we're looking at initial experimentation and research, and it needs to help inform the generation of the initial ideas. So that's that link between what they've done in terms of research and how they've improved and how it informs their ideas. So those early decisions, there needs to be a logical thread there. And if they dismiss ideas, or if they try an experiment and decide, excuse me, decide not to continue with it, again, there needs to be some kind of discussion about why did I dismiss this idea? Why wasn't this working? And that's perfectly good rationalization, and it's really good critical reflection. And for learning aim C, make sure they document their process of selecting suitable materials, techniques, and processes. So this is maybe where this learner maybe dropped a few points because they didn't fully explain why they ended up using the materials they did and how they went through that. So again, it's something that this learner in general did really, really well, but this odd little gap in the evidence there that could have been presented and improved. Okay, before we move on, let's have a look at a learner who got a low mark. I think it's quite important to see this. There is also the availability to see a learner with a mid mark, so a medium mark, and there are other materials available as well. But just for the purpose of this, we'll just compare and contrast a learner who did very well with a learner who is getting much lower marks. So this is for the same assignment. So they're following the narrative theme again. And this is learner work. So don't know if you can read what it says there, but it says Charlie in the Chocolate Factory. So again, the learner is thinking about narrative in a rather straightforward way. They're thinking about stories. They've started by analyzing the actual context and the theme, highlighting particular words, thinking about how that works. So that's not a bad start. That's not a bad way for a learner to think about it. What am I actually being asked to do and why, and starting to analyze it. However basic, they're actually starting to analyze what they need to do in response. Thinking about definitions of narrative. So what is narrative? How can they think about storytelling? And then there's an exhibition about excursions in narrative form. So they've looked at that and thinking about artists who've actually responded to the theme of narrative. Now they're doing some artist research. They've looked at Pablo Picasso. They've put in biographical details here, just said when he was born, when he was died. We don't need that. I mean, I think this is a really important point that when you're looking at artists and designers in terms of informing your own development, we can all Google when Picasso was born and died. We don't need to know about that. You don't need to present that. What we need to know is why have you picked them and what is it you're looking at from the work and why is this relevant to the theme? So this is a very basic bullet points, not all entirely factually accurate, to be fair, and also some kind of Pinterest um, caricature of Picasso. So again, I'm not really sure what this is adding to the research. Then they look at Visnet van Gogh, spell his name wrong as well. But again, it's looking at some examples, giving basic biographical details, not really going beyond a single bullet to say, well, why have I included this in terms of narrative? And then Leonardo da Vinci. So they're really going for the big hitters here. So again, very basic information, some examples of the work. No reference or citations about where all this stuff came from, by the way. So again, that's something that learners should be doing. Even at this level, they should be acknowledging external sources. Then they've done some responses. So they're thinking about how to respond to the different artists. So they've drawn some sunflowers, they've done a line drawing, and they've done rather a nice little piece where they're abstracting a face and working with color. So they are trying to respond in a way to the actual artists and making some notes about it. Now we've got a mind map about narrative, so thinking about the different ways in which narrative is developed. Then they've settled on an idea. So they're looking at a book cover, they're looking at illustration, and they go into Roald Dahl, who famously has beautiful hand-drawn illustrations by Quentin Blake. They're looking at different aspects of the characters. So they've got one of the witches, they've got Tortoise, they've got Charlie Bucket, and they're doing a copy-ish of some of the Quentin Blake illustrations to sort of see how they could develop that. Then they're thinking about initial designs for this book covers. So they're using pertinent symbols from the books. They've got golden ticket, the top hat, the gates. They've decided to go with the gates elements and looking at different ways of laying that out with some discussion in the annotations, some exploration of different media. They're not really messing about with the composition here, but they are looking at different media and different effects. Some use of a grid to sort of discuss how the different effects work and what they might do in terms of helping visual communication. Thinking about why they chose the layout that they did, and then here's the final piece. So there's a jump to the final outcome here. They've gone with a digital outcome, and they've laid it out, and it's got basic shapes and the title of the book. So as you can see, not a particularly high performing learner here, but they did actually follow it through and finish the assignment. So there's work here. So they did get 22 marks. So what we'll see is that they're consistently getting 3 marks as they go through. So they're generally hitting the top of mark band 1 because they don't really very often go beyond limited or basic. But it's still, it's enough to get a few marks. So they've shown limited application of investigation methods. The practitioners that they chose are very superficially linked to the theme. I think there's only really Van Gogh where they mention narrative. The Roald Dahl research is a bit more relevant, although it's, again, quite superficial. The practical responses are quite weak. They've not really got to grips with techniques or media. They've just done drawings in a very simple style of. But the produced illustrations they did for the Roald Dahl books, they show basic understanding. They've thought about what are the visual icons, what are the motifs in the book. So they thought about how to use them. So yeah, top of mark band 1. So it's a limited basic, but it is a response and it is worthy of getting some marks. Grid 2, Experimentation with materials, again, very limited, but there is some awareness of how they could be used to communicate. Outcome B, so now we're looking at generating ideas and communicating. Again, 3 marks. So there's a range of initial thumbnail sketches, decided to develop it further. There is a link to the illustration, but it's been informed by the earlier investigation in a way. So there is a cohesive thread through here, but the range of opportunities chosen are also pretty limited. So now we're developing practical skills. Again, in each case, you find that there might be the odd phrase from Mark Band 2 that you think, well, they kind of done that. And that's what places them at the top of Mark Band 1, really, because they are partially informed by things. There's some skill in applying materials. So they are encouraged to experiment with a range of materials. They don't really analyze this or use it as a basis for deciding, well, which is the most appropriate. And in terms of application and skill, again, quite limited. So they're consistently getting 3 marks throughout, which is quite unusual to get the same number of marks in every band, but in this case, it's accurate. In terms of the application of development review processes, there are some notes about the ideas they came up with. There is some consideration of an idea, except once they got that idea, they stuck with it and they didn't really evolve. They didn't really develop it any further. So they didn't consider how to refine it or develop it particularly. It's a very basic review process. There are annotations, but they're largely descriptive. So they're mostly just telling you what you're looking at rather than justifying why they did it. Now, learning outcome D, we ended up in Mark Band 2 for this, so we decided that actually the portfolio is partially coherent. You do get a logical start to finish with it. There are lots of gaps, obviously, but you can see how this learner got from A to B to C. And there's a basic record of their creative process, but it does lack clarity, and there are some key stages. So again, it's this production process for the final outcome. How and why did they choose to do it digitally? Are the symbols and the simple shapes a creative decision? Was they intentional, or was it just they weren't very good at it and they stuck with basic shapes and didn't get beyond that? So again, we're giving them the benefit of the doubt. They're getting into Mark Band 2 just, but only by 1 mark. So some tips here for the principal moderator. So when producing work digitally, they should be encouraged to document the processes. Use screenshots and annotate these to explain and justify the decision-making process. It's not enough to simply provide the final piece. You've got to see how you got there. And with digital, it can be quite easy to do that because you can screenshot as you go along. You can add notes. It can be quite an easy way of generating some good evidence of a work in progress. And also include evidence of experimentation using the materials, techniques, and processes they intend to use with their final outcome. So again, this is something that this learner didn't particularly do well, and this is why we've put the tips in. So don't forget to make sure that you record this kind of stuff. Okay, hopefully that was useful. We'll go back to the slides. Okay, now we're going to look in more depth at the Pearson set assignment. So what is it that we're actually asking the learners to do? So you've seen 2 examples of responses to that. Now we'll break it down a bit. So the assignment for component 1 is set by Pearson. So Pearson releases the assignment every year, and everybody who's taking component 1 in that series will do the same assignment. So the tasks, it's got the assessment focus, it's got the evidence required, it's got approximate task timings, and I'll explain that in a minute, and also marks per task and per learning outcome. So it's got all of the key elements that you would expect in a BTEC assignment. And how you use it is that it's given to the learners, and you download it from the website for the series that you want. And so, for example, the May, June 2026 Pearson set assignments are already available. And we're going to look at that in a minute. So it was released in September. And at the time of recording this, centres are starting to work on it now, and so they'll be working on it, and the final assessment will be in May. So let's have a look at the Pearson set assignment for June 2026. Here we go. So what you can see here is the front page, and it's really important to note that all of the Pearson set assignments year on year will follow the same format. They'll have the same tasks, they'll have the same time. The difference is the context and the theme that you follow. So it's really useful that you can use the past papers as mocks, as training examples, as practice runs, and then use the real paper for the assessment. But once the learners have got to that point where they're doing the real assessment, the series that they've been entered for, they're already comfortable with the layout and the format and the activities because you'll have been able to use the previous papers as practice. And the only thing that changes is the context and the theme that follows. So we're looking at 20 hours approximately. And the reason why I keep saying approximately, because you've got to remember that this is internal assessment. It's not an exam. You set it, you timetable it yourself in class, in the studio. You oversee it in your own timetable, and it's marked by you. So it's not a requirement to stick religiously to these times. These times are approximate, and they're what we expect centres to timetable to allow learners sufficient time to do this. So it starts with instructions to learners, and it explains they've got to read all the information. It's really important, it says at the start there, that the tasks actually link into each other. So don't just read task one and do it and then go off to task two. You've got to read it all, go through it all. And of course, when you hand this out to your learners, it's really useful to talk it through with them and explain how the tasks work, when you'll be timetabling them, what you're expected to do, and just talk it through and make sure that they all understand completely what the requirements are and what they need to do in response. So it's got a discussion of the timings. It mentions that any sources of information need to be clearly identified and referenced, and understanding that plagiarism is a form of cheating. So they've got to think about making sure they're not copying any other work or passing off work as their own. Explains what they can ask for. So you can ask the teacher for support if you have questions about the requirements or the evidence you need to produce. That's fine. But the teacher can't give you feedback on how to improve it or guide you solutions. It's really important that the learner's work is individual and authentic to them, and it's their response to the actual piece. And a quick bullet list of the resources needed. So obviously they need a space to work. They need access to a range of art and design materials relevant to the program they're doing. Appropriate safety equipment, of course. The key thing is that they've got a range of materials to choose from because selection of the most appropriate materials is part of the assessment. They will need access to a library or internet to do the underpinning research because they've got to research the context, the theme, they've got to research products, other artists and designers, and resources for recording and evidencing work. So in most cases, they'll be working on physical pieces. So they're going to need to capture that through cameras. They may use printers. Remember, the assessment for component one is internal. So you're not sending this off to anybody once it's finished. It remains in your center. So the moderator will come to you. So it does mean that the format and the medium that the learners use can be anything. But it's also good practice for them to record that. They might want to collate it into a digital or online portfolio for the ease of presentation. So again, that's something, it's a skill they should build up. And remember with component two, which is the external assessment, that is sent off to Pearson. So that in that case, they will definitely have to produce a digital portfolio. So it's no problem with actually getting them to practice that with component one and giving them a chance to try that out, even though they're not actually sending this off. So think about the resources required and the time given to actually collating the portfolio and putting it together. So now we have the vocational context. This is the thing that does change every year. So for this one, this is the current paper that learners are currently following now, and the theme is consumerism. So consumerism refers to the tendency of individuals to purchase and continually acquire goods and services. It involves the act of purchasing and the joy of owning something new. The notion of human beings as consumers first took shape before World War I, but became more common in the 20s. However, the concept of consumerism can be seen in a very different ways. It's never more evident than on Black Friday. So we're talking about the theme of consumerism, a little bit of historical social context, and then focusing in on Black Friday as an exemplar of how this works in context. Also recognizing that it's been introduced to the UK from the US, and actually there's a question there about, well, why do we even have it in the UK? Because it's not a thing. You know, we don't have Thanksgiving, we don't have the the impetus that actually drives Black Friday. So there's a question there about globalism and how different cultures, manners, and consuming cycles actually are becoming a global phenomenon now. Talks about marketing strategies such as FOMO, fear of missing out, limited time offers. It's talking about those who oppose consumerism and buy nothing day. So again, what we're looking for learners to do is explore this theme both from a positive and a negative point, and actually think about, well, what do they think about it? What's their opinion? What's their approach? And how can they respond to that in a visual, in a creative way? So it talks about practitioners examining the theme and as a way to either critically evaluate it or to celebrate it. So taking it as a starting point, develop and create an outcome or outcomes that reflect the theme. So that's the brief from Pearson. And as we saw in the example earlier, you are allowed in the PDF to put in an extra context. So you can't change the theme, you can't change the subject that they're responding to. But if you're doing, for example, graphic design, or you're doing photography, or you're doing ceramics, or you're doing fashion, you might want to adapt the vocational context to make it more specific and more relevant to your course, and that's absolutely fine. So now we're going into the tasks. So task 1 is investigation. So they need to investigate consumerism, and the results of this will inform all your work for the project. So again, it keeps hammering home this message that initial investigation, initial research should be purposeful and should be relevant to the outcomes and the theme and the ideas that they're going to come up with. So you've got to think about research of artists and designers, explore the formal elements, and of course they should have all been taught about formal elements, and properties of the materials, design principles, techniques and processes. Think about that. What it doesn't ask for is when were they born and when did they die and who were they married to and all of that. It's not relevant. We're talking about pertinent investigation into artists and designers. You'll notice the bullet says primary and secondary research into themes, so they need to be given opportunities to undertake primary research. Initial practical responses, so testing and experimentations, looking at others' approaches and exploring how they might be able to use that in their own work. And importantly, annotation reflecting on the research, not simply describing it, but reflecting it, evaluating it. And there's some suggested evidence. So sketchbook, worksheets, or blog, but covering those 4 bullets. And we're saying there's approximately 3 hours to complete this task. So you would timetable that yourselves and you would explain how that's going to work. But obviously for this one, they're going to need access to external resources, internet, library, example. Task 2 is ideas generation. So they're looking about approximately 6 hours for this. And this is about taking that initial investigation, coming up with their own ideas. So you've got about 6 hours to think of an idea and start work on that using different ideas generation methods and making sure they record these. So photographs, mind maps, mood boards, further experimentation, maquettes, rough drafts, wireframes if they're working digitally. But again, annotated practical work. So thinking about not just producing the ideas generation, but constantly taking a step back and thinking about, well, how good is this idea and how is it going to work for me? Task 3 is the actual creation of the final outcome. We're looking at approximately 8 hours here. So they've got to review and evaluate their research and ideas and progress so far. So again, don't just leap into it with both feet. Think about what they've produced so far, cogitate over the quality of their idea and how they can develop it into a final outcome. But the evidence here, of course, is the final outcome, but it's the record of the development and refinement. So how did they get there? And it's getting learners to understand that a big part of assessment in these vocational qualifications is making sure that they get the credit for the work they put in. So it's really important that they're recording their work as they go. They're making notes about their decisions and reviewing their working processes so that they develop this portfolio which tells the story of how they got from initial idea to final piece. And then finally, the presentation. So they're given an extra 3 hours to collate this and put the portfolio or collection together. So again, really important that they think about that time about, okay, well, I've finished now, I've finished the final outcome, I've produced the piece in response to the brief. Now I've actually got to present my portfolio. So think about the presentation of a portfolio as a separate activity. They've got to communicate their creative process and their ideas, record and organize their work so they don't have to put everything in. They can select and edit the most pertinent evidence and add annotations and think about how to explain to a viewer who's never met them, who didn't see them working on it, how they produce the work. Okay, back to the slides. So hopefully you'll see how that works in terms of an actual practical project. And it's very similar to all internally assessed BTEC assignments. The only difference is Pearson set it. But that saves you a job, and it also means that you don't have to do internal verification. It makes life a lot easier. But you can use the past papers as mocks. You can use the past papers as you really go into detail with the learners and say, this is how it's laid out. This is how the tasks work. This is the mark grid, and the this is what I'll be looking at when I assess your work. And so everything's transparent and open with a BTEC. So you can explain to the learners your expectations and their responsibilities and the activities they need to do. And it will hopefully help make sure that when they come to the actual assessment itself, that they're more relaxed about it, they're more familiar with the process so that they can actually concentrate on just producing their best work. Okay. As this is internal assessment, BTEC rules and the regulatory requirements do allow for resubmissions if necessary and potentially even retakes, but we'll talk about the feasibility of that in a minute. So they've got one component, they've got 20 hours, they've submitted their assignment. If after you've marked it, you feel that some of the learners may not have achieved their expected potential, or maybe they've missed bits of evidence out that they could have included, or that they haven't really explained themselves very well, you may authorize a resubmission. Now, what that means is they can go back and look at the work and improve parts of it, and then you remark it. Now, it's really important to note, and again, this is a general rule for all BTECs from entry level all the way up to high nationals, is the feedback you give to learners here. You can talk in general terms about why they received the marks they did, and maybe why they didn't receive some of the higher marks, and which areas in general they need to work on. But you can't give them step-by-step specific instructions on what they need to do or what decisions they need to make, because you've got to remember that this is their individual response, it's their work. If you start being so prescriptive and start hand-holding and coach them too much, whose work is it? It kind of becomes your decisions and your work. So many teachers are very, very well versed in this now. So you can see how from the mark scheme, from the assignment that they were given, which explains what they had to do, and your feedback to them, a learner should be able to understand what they need to go away and do if they're going to improve their work. But remember, the decision to give a resubmission is entirely up to you, and it's based on whether you think that the learner can improve without any further instruction in a short space of time by an agreed deadline, in time for the moderation process. So you can do that and you remark the work, but once moderation starts, so once the moderator is allocated and this process starts, you need to submit marks. So once those marks are submitted, there's no further resubmission. So one thing you might need to think about is when does the piece finish? You've got a very large window for component one because you can be doing this in the autumn term and the actual moderation process doesn't happen till into the summer. So at some point you may offer the learners a resubmission opportunity, but still have plenty of time to remark it and get it done. But once the marks are submitted, that's it in terms of resubmission. Now, there is also a facility for a retake, but we need to think very carefully about the feasibility of this. So if necessary, learners are permitted to retake internal assessments once that series is finished. So if a learner finishes component one, they get marked, it gets moderated, it gets sent off, they get the results, and you still feel that they just messed up and they could have probably done a lot better, then there is the opportunity for a retake. And this is a general rule from the regulator that allows for that. However, it's a retake in complete from start to scratch. So they've got to do a new assignment. So they have to do the next Pearson set assignment in the next series. And as we know, with art and design, because it's a 20-hour practical assignment, it only comes out once a year. So a retake may not actually be feasible for your learners because if you've done component one in the second year of a program, they'll have left. And so the retake isn't really there. It's much better, I think, in terms of allowing the learners to develop at their own pace and giving them and getting them best prepared for it and making sure they're not anxious by putting them in too early, is make sure that you've prepared the learners with past papers, with mocks, with your teaching and learning phase and making sure that they've understood how to go through an assignment and how to develop ideas and what evidence is required in a formative way before they sit the actual internal assessment, because the feasibility and the practical logistics of doing a retake may not be possible in your centre. You've got to think about that very carefully. And it's not something we'd recommend anyway. It's there as a safety net. It's there as a fallback. But what we really want is for learners to get it right first time. So the better prepared they are, the less chance there is that you'd need that. And we don't get very many retakes. It's quite an unusual thing, simply because of the practicalities involved. Okay, so when is this assessment available? So we have an overview here. So we've got two components. Now it's worth noting at this point, with art and design practice, we only have component one and component two. If you're talking in the staff room with some of your colleagues who maybe do business or sport, for example, they might have three components. Historically, Tech Awards had three components, but what we found with the previous specification for art and design is that many centres merged components one and two, the internal assessment bits. And in fact, we got to the point where we were writing example assignment briefs that also merged those components. So when it came to writing these in 2022, we talked to a lot of centres and we talked about the practicalities of how it worked. And it was generally agreed that actually, let's just have one component for the internally assessed process. So what you see with art and design, which is unusual compared to some other subjects, is we only have component one internally assessed and component two is externally assessed. If your exams officer or if other members of staff are asking you where your component three is, you can reassure them that there isn't one for art and design. So the release of the Pearson set assignment for component one is in early September. So the one we have looked at, the consumerism one, that's the one that learners are working on right now. Because generally speaking, September to December is when internal assessment takes place. You do the marking, you make sure that you fit in time for resubmissions if you're going to authorize any and get the marking all finished. Now, the moderation window isn't until May to June, and the deadline for submission of centre marks in terms of art and design practice is 48 hours before the moderation visit. So your moderator will have been allocated and they'll have been in touch to negotiate a date for their visit. And at least 2 days before that visit, preferably longer, but certainly at least 2 days before, you need to have made sure you've submitted the centre marks so that the sample can be selected. And we'll go through that moderation process in more detail in a minute. But ultimately, they need notice of what the marks and the rank order are in order to then select a sample. And the earlier you do that, the more preparation time you've got to make sure your samples are available and ready for when the moderator comes in. The externally assessed component, I know we're not focusing on that in this session, but we'll just mention it very quickly. So the set task is released in January for component 2. And again, it's a similar kind of thing. They have a practical assessment and the learners respond to it. The big difference here is that the controls are slightly tighter, the timings are slightly narrower, and the work is then sent off to Pearson and examined by examiners. So between January and May, that's when learners are doing external assessment. So again, you'll see, if you plan it well, component 1 and component 2 don't overlap and they don't get in the way of each other. Gives you time, a bit of breathing space to get 1 through before you'd start with 2. And the submission deadline is May. And then we go through the whole moderation, examination, awarding processes, and the results will be published in August. So let's have a look in more depth at the moderation process itself. So as we said, the process is that once you've got your final marks, you've actually given the learners the opportunity to submit. If you've included a resubmission, you've done that, you've marked it, you have your final set of marks based on the mark grids. You submit that by Edexcel Online. So your exams officer will have access to that and they will be able to write the marks in for each learner. Once that Pearson has those marks, then there will be a random selection of the sample. The only thing that isn't random on the sample is that the highest achieving learner and the lowest achieving learner will be included. So we get the full range. And then within that, you've got a random sample. And that'll be confirmed before the submission window opens in each series, so the work can be prepared for final moderation. So you give us notice for when the marks go in, and Pearson will give you notice so that you can prepare those samples ready. So what will be moderated? So as I said, the highest and lowest marks, and then a mix of the middle marks. We're looking at 15 in general, 15 samples. I'll explain the sizes on the next slide. Now, many of your colleagues, again in other subjects, if they're doing written papers or they're doing shorter components, then they may use the learner work transfer where they digitally upload work onto a platform provided by Pearson. Now, for art and design, for component 1, we don't need to do that because we understand that the physical nature of much of the evidence means that that could be quite difficult. It adds an extra layer of complication for you. So what we've agreed is that the moderator will come in and visit. So unless the moderator requests further evidence afterwards, or if you are producing fully digital submissions and you feel that actually it's going to be easier to just upload it to the learner work transfer, then you can discuss that with the moderator and as an option. But in general speak, the moderator will come into your center and visit. So you need to provide them with a room with the 15 samples laid out with the correct evidence, and they will get on with the moderation process on the day. So here's the process in a timeline. You input the marks, including any resubmissions. The sample is then selected and confirmed with you, so you'll be told what it is. And then you need to make sure that on the day of the moderation, you've got the learner work, you've got the assessment record sheet, so what were the marks you gave the learner and what was the feedback you gave them. And of course, the declaration of authenticity needs to be there as well. So all learners must sign a declaration of authenticity for everything they submit for assessment. So preparing for that, make sure you've inputted the final marks. Make sure that you're prepared for the size of the sample and just check in case Pearson, the random mark hasn't included the highest and lowest. If it hasn't, make sure you stick those in as well. And the size itself, if you've got small numbers and you've got fewer than 15 learners in your class, then they'll all be sampled. So that's nice and simple. It's just everybody. If you've got 16 to 100, the sample size will be 15. So for the vast majority of centres, we're looking at a sample of 15 learners. If you've got a particularly large cohort, then it might actually jump to 20, but only if you've got more than 100 learners in a group. And if you've got more than 200, well, first of all, lucky you. Second of all, you get 25 to look at. So again, it's a sliding scale there. So in terms of the timeline, the moderator will contact your quality nominee. Now, every BTEC centre internationally, all around the UK, right in the world, has a single named person, the quality nominee, who's generally responsible for quality assurance in your centre. But the key thing is that we've got their contact details. So they're the person we get in touch with for any Pearson related business. The quality nominee should then pass that on to the program leader so that you can arrange the date for the sampling and understand how the process is going to work. You negotiate the day with the moderator. It's based on your availability and their availability within the window, and they'll come in. And once they've completed their moderation, they'll provide an initial moderator feedback report. So because they're visiting for art and design, you'll get verbal feedback. So they'll tell you what their judgments are, what their decisions are, and what they think about the accuracy of assessment at the end of the day. But it'll be collated into an initial moderator feedback report, which is then emailed to your exams officer and quality nominee. That draft report provides feedback on the accuracy of marking. So are you marking in general too harshly, or are you marking too generously, or is it right? And they'll refer to the mark band, the tasks and mark ranges. This gives you an opportunity to then compare what their feedback is and whether you might need to amend any of the marks. So we'll talk about that at the next slide. But remember, the moderator is giving you that initial feedback so that you can then take action if required to address the marks. If there are significant differences, now this is quite rare. Generally speaking, people are, within tolerance. If there's some real significant differences in the centre marks and the moderator marks, or if the moderator marks look like the rank order of learners is going to be changed because actually one learner just seems to be at their assessment is way off, they might request further samples. And so again, they'll give you that feedback and say, I'm really not sure about some of this assessment. I need to look further. And in that case, they'll negotiate with you how to get further samples or suggest another meeting to discuss it. But again, it's quite rare because normally speaking, it's a general moderating up or down. The key thing to remember is that moderation is only based on that sample. So what you will need to do in terms of assessment, if you need to amend them, you need to apply that feedback to all learners. So your marking will affect everybody, not just the ones that were sampled. So the feedback in the report can't comment on individual learners really, because it's about general trends or general accuracy. So there's no specific marks or individual learners' work that are going to be reported on. So if there are any discrepancies, you've got the opportunity then to amend your initial marks if you wish to, using edX Online. So if the moderator comes in, looks at the 15 samples and says, well, actually, I think you're being a bit harsh, and my marks are all a bit higher than yours, and they'll explain how and explain what the issue is. You've then got that opportunity to bring your marks up in line with the moderator feedback. And remember, you'd need to do that for the whole cohort. You don't do it for individual learners. By the other token, if the moderator feels that actually you've been a bit generous and overstated the achievement of all the learners, then he or she might recommend that you lower your marks. And again, they'll talk about by how much and what the issues are and why. So you have the opportunity to amend these marks, and you can change that on edXL Online and redo that. You're not required to do that. You don't have to change the marks, but bear in mind, if the moderator's told you this and suggested that you do, then it's probably a good idea to do it, because if you don't amend the marks and then subsequently, once we go through the actual awarding process, they may be amended by Pearson anyway. So it's probably better that you take control of that process and amend them yourself so that you're happy with how it's laid out. So it allows you to act on the feedback immediately during the series, and then the window for amending marks might not be available if there have been further extensions requests. So again, if there have been issues and the moderation process has gone on longer than intended because it's needed further discussion, then that amendment opportunity might not be there. But the actual act of requesting further submissions or meeting the requirements would probably have addressed those issues anyway. So there's a clear deadline by which final submitted amended marks is finished. So there's a point at which you can't amend marks any further. So you've got that window following the moderation before this deadline to actually make any changes. And then following moderation feedback and any amendments, the moderator then reviews the final centre marks. So they'll go back into the system, check the marks that you've finalised and agreed upon, and then they will update their moderator feedback report based on what they found. So if they suggested that you knock everybody up a mark and then you go and do it, then their moderator feedback report will then reflect that you've amended the marks. And that will be published on results day. Now, once that's gone through, the whole process then goes to awarding. So awarding is a back office process by Pearson. The principal moderator manages it with a team of moderators and scrutineers, and they will look at the awarding process. So as long as the centre marks are within tolerance, they're reasonably accurate, they'll be awarded. If they're still not within an acceptable degree of accuracy compared to national standards, so for example, if the moderator gave you feedback to amend the marks and you didn't do it, and as a result your marks are definitely out of kilter with the national standards, then Pearson will adjust them. In terms of the Pearson system, the pattern of difference between your final centre marks and the moderator's marks will be considered. So the final marks are in line with the standard being applied nationally. So this is why the awarding process goes into this it's a way of moderating the moderators, if you like. So the moderators come in, made decisions, they've been trained and standardized themselves. And then this is a way of checking that actually the final amended marks not only agree with what the moderator said, but the moderator's judgments agree with the national standard. So there's a flattening out of the process to make sure that no particular centre is being disadvantaged. And if there are any adjustments, remember it's going to apply to all learners, not just those sampled. So the rank order, that's why it's important, because the learners who got the highest achievement in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 will remain in that order, even if the marks go up or down. So your top achieving learner will stay at the top, your bottom achieving learner will stay at the bottom. Just a little note about consortia. Now, there's not many consortia in the UK these days, but if you do work in a consortium in collaboration, direct collaboration with other centres, then that sample goes across the whole consortium. So you're taking responsibility for all of the centres and all of the programs within that consortium. So it's really important to know that any amendments, any adjustments, and any judgments will be made across all of the centres in the consortium. So it's really important that you undertake internal standardisation of the marking to make sure that all of your teachers, all of your assessors are marking accurately and consistently with each other. So it's really good practice to have some cross communication with the different centres in your consortium. But one program lead needs to take responsibility for that. So one person will be in charge of the whole thing, making sure that all of the programs in the consortia are getting the feedback and following it up. Again, if you're not in a consortium, don't worry about it. But if you are, you should know and you should recognise that all the learners are effectively registered on the same program, just at different centres. Now, in terms of recording the assessment, there is a template available. The one on the left is the record sheet, and you'll notice that this just has quite straightforward. It's got the key data for the program title, which component it is, the assessor name, the learner name, the registration number, confirming which series and year you're doing. And then what you've got is for each task, you've got the overall mark. And then you've got the total mark. So you can see clearly what the learner got for each task and how it adds up. And here also you've got general comments. So this is feedback to the learner about their achievement. Now remember, in almost every case, in fact, probably in every case, they're going to be doing component 1 before component 2. So a lot of the feedback you're giving here can be really useful to help them develop and improve on their achievement in component 2, where they're going to be doing a slightly different but still very similar creative process. So the learner signs to say, this is authentic work, it's my own, and that they've received this feedback. You sign it to say that as far as you're aware, it's individual authentic work from the learner as well. So there's double declaration there to make sure that you've agreed that all of the work is authentically that individual's work. And you'll need to show that assessment record sheet to the moderator as well for the learner sampled. The sheet on the right is a spreadsheet which basically breaks it down into the mark grid, and you can use this if you wish, and it just allows you to actually record the individual marks against each statement. So again, it's quite useful to have that if you want, and it's a way of actually then being able to provide the raw marks for each element of the assignment. Now, because we've delegated authority to you to make those assessment decisions, you're deciding what marks the learners get. Inevitably, there's a quality assurance process, but what you'll see is because of the way the Tech Awards have been running since 2022, it's much reduced. So we've worked out that it's a 65% reduction in administration compared to the previous Tech Awards and BTEC Firsts, for example. What you've seen is that, yes, you have a quality nominee, but there's no requirement to have a lead internal verifier anymore or use Oscar. You should standardize the BTEC team, but you don't need to worry about an assessment plan or IV plan because the timescales for the Pearson set assignments and the externally set tasks are managed by Pearson again. So as long as you know when the series starts and finish and make sure you enter the learners at the right time, you don't have to put in huge planning documents. The assignments are written by Pearson for both components, so you don't need to devise new assignment briefs. You don't need to internally verify them because they've already been quality checked. So there's a lot of things that you don't have to do anymore, which takes a lot of the burden off you in terms of administration and allows you to get on with teaching, get on with the fun stuff of actually getting the learners engaged with the subject and getting them prepared for assessment. And then the rest of it, so assessment records, feedback to learners, of course, that's still necessary for component 1, not component 2, remember, because that's externally assessed. Internal standardization is going to be required if you've got multiple assessors. So we do recommend, if you have more than one person making those decisions, make sure that you talk to each other and compare notes and think about that. If you are the only assessor on a program, I think it's still very good practice to get a colleague to just look at your marks and have a discussion and maybe do an internal sample just to support you so that you're not working entirely on your own and relying solely on the moderator feedback. Okay. Awarding and grading. We talked about how Pearson takes those raw marks and then we then convert that into pass, merit, and distinction grades. So awarding is the process used to determine those grade boundaries. And it's really important to note that those grade boundaries change in each series. So the raw marks that a learner gets in one year may not equate to exactly the same grade in the raw marks for another learner in the following year. Reason is that the awarding process, it ensures that learners receive a fair and consistent grade, regardless of which awarding organisation they take their qualification with or when they complete their course. So anybody doing a level 1/level 2 qualification in art and design practice in that year should achieve parity in terms of their overall grade, regardless of the year, the series they took, the paper they took, the context. So the grade boundaries indicate the minimum number of raw marks students need to achieve a particular grade. So it's pass, merit, distinction at level 1 and 2. And what we do is we have subject expert awarding committees. So the principal, moderator, and various assessment managers and other subject experts will work together to balance a range of the evidence and decide where the grade boundaries should fall. So remember, this is done after the completion of the series, just like with A-levels, GCSEs, and other vocational qualifications. The way they'll do that is that they convert the raw mark into a uniform mark scale mark. And this allows you to apply that raw mark to a fixed scale of grade boundaries. Now, it's really important to note that this calculation is published afterwards, and it's shown how that was done. You don't need to worry about the difference between raw marks and uniform mark scales. It's a back office thing that Pearson does to make sure that there's parity and it works all together. So the grade boundary is based on the marks that you gave your learner and how that relates to a grade. That may change from each assessment series. The UMS is the scale that is locked in with the grade boundaries, if you see. But what happens is, at the end of each series, that will be published and the calculator will show you how this was all worked out and how marks were then applied and how they relate to the final grades. So you've got a link here, the raw mark to grade calculator converter. So that will be changed after each series to explain how it works. It's not usually a significant change, but it just gives that opportunity for a series to be amended and adapted to ensure parity, not only across all centres, but year on year across the qualification. So in order to get a grade, learners must sit and achieve an outcome for all components. So they need to have actually submitted something. They need to have actually done the work. You can't get something for not turning up or not handing anything in. And there isn't a minimum grade outcome required. So there's no minimum level 1 pass for any component. If they get a U because they didn't get any marks in a particular area, that is still considered an outcome, as long as they were present and they actually submitted something and they did the work. Being absent doesn't count. These raw marks are then converted into UMS points, and the UMS points will be converted for a component on a 6th grade scale. So the highest a learner will get for a component is a level 2 distinction. This goes down from level 2 merit, level 2 pass, level 1 distinction, level 1 merit, down to a level 1 pass. And in terms of the overall qualification, this is based on a 7th grade scale. So there's actually an extra level on top of a level 2 distinction for the overall qualification. And that's a level 2 distinction star. So again, the final grade is an aggregation of the marks for each component. So what this means is that it's compensatory. So if a learner does particularly well in component 1, doesn't do quite so well in component 2, that will be balanced out in their achievement overall and in terms of their overall qualification grade. So they get an individual grade for each component, but the qualification grade is a combination of the two, so it's aggregated out. And then the level 2 distinction star, that's if a learner's got distinctions for both components at level 2, but also there's the extra grade boundary above. So if they've done really well and they've gone not just scraped into the distinction, but they've got even better, then they may end up with a distinction star as well. And those grade boundaries are all published after the fact, so you can see exactly where learners landed, and you can see how the grades were achieved. On results day, you'll have access to the moderator reports, and these are available on edX Online, and they're published on the website, and the principal moderator report from the subject qualification page. So you'll have your moderator report for your centre, and then the principal moderator report is an overview of how the whole series went. And it's really useful in terms of analysing where learners did well, where learners didn't do so well, in terms of the national picture, and hints and tips on how to get the best out of it. So not only does the principal moderator report show you a pattern for that particular series, if you build them up year on year and read through them, you'll be able to see if there's a particular pattern for learners in general at this level and things that you really need to look out for or things that you could be doing well. And you can learn from that because the principal moderator will be writing this document as a guide to help you with it. So we'll look at it after this slide. We've got an example of a principal moderator's feedback. Of course, if there's an issue and you find that actually you're not happy with the moderation once it's finished, I mean, hopefully, because of going through the moderator process and having that initial feedback and then amending marks, you should be expecting certain results. If you're unhappy with the results, then you can request a review of moderation. So if you feel that actually your moderator's been too harsh and you haven't got the results that you believe that your learners deserve, then you can request that. You can't do it until results day because obviously the whole thing's gone through awarding, and so there may have been changes since you last spoke to the moderator. And what happens here is the sample is then provided to a more senior moderator. So it's really important that you've got that sample that you first initially used, you still have that available, because you'll then provide that to the senior moderator and they will make a new objective judgment based on the evidence, based on what your marks were, based on what the moderator said, and they will come to a judgment. And the good thing is it's kind of a win-win. You can't reduce the grades at this point. So what will happen is the moderator will the senior moderator will either agree with the initial moderator decisions and say, no, actually it is accurate, it does fit the national picture, there's no issue here, so the grades will stay the same, or they feel that actually the moderator was too harsh and there was an issue and they've acknowledged that, and your marks might go up. But what they can't do is go down. So you can't lose, if you like, if you're particularly concerned about it. And it's an opportunity for you to actually address any issues you've got, but it doesn't actually come at any risk. Again, we don't get many because most of the time going through the moderation process, the opportunity to amend marks before they're submitted and the awarding process that then irons out any inconsistencies usually means that the grades are acceptable and they do reflect what you're expecting. Before we go on to key dates and reminders, I'll just give you an option to look at the principal moderator's report. So let's have a quick look here. I won't go into detail, but you'll see that it's feedback after each series. So this is for the June 2025. So this is the current, most recent one. And there'll be another one out in June 2026. And it gives an explanation about what the grade boundaries are and how to set them and how it works. There's an introduction to the overall component and how the component works to explain the context within which it works and the tasks. Reconfirming the mark grids used. But the key thing, I think, is when you get into the performance of the component. So this is the bit where the principal moderator is talking about this particular PSA, how it went, how the theme was responded to, how it was received. So this one was travel. So 2025, the theme was travel. Most centres found that quite easy to engage with. Learners didn't have a trouble understanding it, and it was flexible enough for them to bring personal stories, cultural backgrounds, and individual interests. So it made for an interesting response and clearly a strong sense of ownership. And again, that's really important, that the learners provided an individual creative response and they felt they owned it. What we're looking at is, if as we go in, you then break down into the tasks and say, okay, well, what happened with these tasks? And this is quite important. So you say like stronger and weaker responses. So it's quite useful to see that. So lots of evidence of learners exploring the work of a range of both historical and contemporary practitioners, which is good. Stronger submissions showed a secure understanding of stylistic influences and media handling, with learners confidently applying their research to inform experimentation. For weaker responses, the learner's response often consisted of basic research, including biographical information, pastiche copies of the work of practitioners, not demonstrating much understanding. So I think this is the key thing, that it's about selecting practitioners based on the connection to the theme, but you'll see there how the principal moderator has reflected some of the stuff we've talked about with the examples of the standardization materials, about how making those links and making informed decisions about who you're going to look at and why you're looking at them, and then what you're going to say about them is really important. So it goes through each of the tasks, strengths and weaknesses, talks about it, but then there's a summary. So it's got some really useful hints and tips. So explains what we're really looking at. So again, all of these things can be really used in terms of your delivery and explaining to centres and explaining to your assessors, also explaining to your learners what we're looking for and how they can improve their evidence and what kind of things they should be putting in. Then there's a link to useful support and information at the end. So I'll mention here Jacqueline Veed, the subject advisor. Her teaching art and design group is very, very useful, very responsive for ongoing support and guidance throughout the year. Okay, back to the slides. So just finishing up here, we've got key dates and reminders. So this is taken from the key dates document, which is published online on the website, and it will show clearly what the process is in terms of timelines. I won't go into a lot of detail because there's a lot of stuff here, but basically it's got when is the PSA released, when is the entry window for the series, when are the deadlines, when does the moderator feedback report come out, when are the results released. So you notice you have a restricted release of results to centres a week before the results are released to learners. Then you've got the window for review of marking or moderation. So you have clear deadlines, and these are republished every year to make sure that it's absolutely accurate and you know exactly when things need to be done by. So key reminders, remember, you can access these Pearson set assignments at any point once they've been published, between then and when you actually start the assessment. So make sure you build in time to go through the paper with the learners and start discussing ideas and getting getting reassurance that they understand what they're being asked to do before you start and press go, before you actually say, right, we're starting the 20 hours now. So plenty of time in class to talk it through with them and make sure that they're clear and comfortable and they understand what their responses need to be. Remember, they must be entered for internal assessments in the series they're going to be sitting them. You may choose to put your learners in different series. There's one a year, but obviously you may be delivering the program over more than 1 year. So you register the learners at the start of the program so Pearson knows that there's a cohort that exists, but you enter them for the internal assessment in the series they're going to do. So we know that there's a requirement to allocate a moderator, and we know that we'll be expecting submission of marks. Entry deadlines are published in that key date schedule. And while sitting the PSAs, learners can refer to their own course notes made during teaching and learning. Remember, this isn't an exam. It isn't high level of supervision. They can be building on ideas and thoughts that they've had with previous projects, but of course it needs to be relevant to the new theme and the new context. But they can refer to them, but obviously they're generating new or individual authentic evidence for this project. And finally, the additional support and resources you have available. Of course, there's the Pearson set assignments, but remember that you've got the previous papers as well. They're all still there as well, and you can use those as practice runs, as mocks, as ways of preparing your learners for the one that they will then ultimately sit. Entries need to be done via Edexcel Online. So again, you need to talk to your exams officer and liaise with them to make sure that that's done in the series that you want to enter them for. There is a frequently asked questions webpage available. So again, if you've got any concerns or questions, these questions for art and design practice will go through to Jacqueline and her team, and they're very responsive and they'll be able to help. But the frequently asked questions are then generated because in many cases, a question you may have has already been asked. So again, it's quite useful to get that, and you can access that at any time. We've got on-demand training. So there's a BTEC Tech Award resource hub. So again, worth looking at the link there and looking at the bite-sized playlist. So lots of different guidance on different topics and subjects there that you might be able to use in your teaching and learning of the Tech Awards. But we have more live events. So for example, we have one that focuses on the external assessment component. We have a general overview, which is good for new teachers to the qualification, and standardization events and other training available via the training team, and course materials. So on your specification page, so if you go to the Pearson qualification website, simplest thing I find to do is to follow the subject heading and go to art, design and media. And then down the right hand side, you'll have a menu which shows you all of the qualification levels. Pick on the art and design practice, all of the materials that we've been using today, and all of the guidance that I've referred to is on that one page. So you've got the specification, and then in the course materials, you've got lots and lots of information and previous training events available to you at any time, free of charge. Okay, all it remains for me to say is thank you very much for your time. I hope you found this event useful and hope to see you soon at a live event in the future. Thank you very much.